Okay, so we're now going to be going on to our second speaker, Quain. Clo is a policy analyst at the IIEA, Ireland's leading think tank for international and European affairs. Previously, she worked for the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs in Vienna, the EU Institute for Security Studies in Paris, and the European Parliament in Brussels. She holds a master's from the College of Europe. Over to you, Clo.
Thanks, Kate. Just putting on my timer there as well. And many thanks for having me as part of this panel. It's a really, really interesting discussion, and I think hopefully today will give you the different viewpoints. So as Kate mentioned, I worked in a variety of different areas, from government to EU institutions, private sector, and now think tanks. So today I'm going to be presenting a think tank perspective in a personal capacity, but just providing broad brushstrokes so that you can um, understand what the work of a think tank is. So first of all, maybe just what I'll do is I'll give you a run through of the different types of think tanks. So traditionally there was, the classic model for a think tank where you have a very established community of civil servants, academia, NGOs, private sector, and they were very traditional profiles. So most had PhDs, moved through a traditional policy trajectory in their careers. And then it had very, traditional avenues also for funding. And now we've kind of seen a bit of an evolution of that. So a new form is a hybrid where, the think tank is actually more aware of the dynamic policy changes that are taking place. It's speaking to a much wider audience than before. Maybe its funding is more diversified. Maybe it's running more events because it's meant to be more public facing than solely focusing on research. And it's also tailoring output to corporates and C-suite. And this is something that I even saw within the EU, is that they were tailoring it much more to audiences so that it's short, snappy, to the point. And I think Isabel pointed that out very clearly as well. You have very short of time, a very narrow window, and you have to get your points across. So each of them have to carry weight. And then the third type I put here was a sort of think and do tank, and that's kind of been much more for the next generation, where younger leaders are looking at kind of creative solutions to complex issues like climate change, education, and economics, and not just looking solely at the kind of theoretical model, but also what they can do about it, so it connects the dots more. So how has the policy landscape changed, and how is that kind of interacting then and impacting on think tanks? Well, one is that the policy space is much bigger than before. Government, industry, and public interests are much more interwoven, and that means you have to consider that in your audience as well. Who you speak to, how you write, how you format everything. So think tanks need to assess those multiple points of interaction. The second one is obviously that, sovereign states are no longer lone actors. As Kate was mentioning at the start, there's various ways you can interact today. We see online petitions and a lot more monitoring of popularity polls than before. So, there's a lot of competing forces essentially. And that's something that, think tanks have to consider when they're looking at the overall landscape. And then the third is perhaps more related to briefings, and it's something definitely that Politico did. I was in Brussels when Politico came, and it completely changed the landscape. And what it did was it tapped into subjectivity. What were the dynamics and impressions in the room? Because quite often while politicians can be cautious of the wording in case it's misinterpreted, media or other figures can actually read the behavior quite well. And that's something that's, been really, really interesting. I think, particularly in the Brexit negotiations, just even the whole concept of being alone at the table or not being in a core group that's negotiating, and that applies to other states as well. There's a perception that there isn't as much involvement. So there's a bit more read-in from that point of view. So where then would you factor into policy? So as I said, it's a much more expanded space than before. There are fewer silos, which is a really positive thing. And there's much more diversity of thought and representation. You have also you're coming from different communities and you're aware of all of their different viewpoints. So, you have an opportunity to bring those to the fore. If you're not, haven't solely been in a policy trajectory, but you have access to other groups, you can anticipate some of the implications of those, for instance. And also, you very likely have, if you're entering policy from a different field, you have a broad skill base and an outsider status. And an outsider status doesn't have to have a negative connotation. I know it's earned that more recently, but there can be real advantages to that as well. I think Macron actually said recently that had he not become, he was in banking previously, but had he not become a president, he would have become an entrepreneur. And he's invested huge amounts in tech. And they have a Station F, which is a huge startup incubator that's supported by the state. So that's kind of an indicator of how you can shape things more. Then obviously, we've moved from the traditional landscape where it's a more senior demographic where, they're experienced and there's kind of an established viewpoint. Now there's, you can bring a lot more energy and clarity from your standpoint into the equation. And then finally, in international base, I think our generation, I've lived in 7 countries just to give an example, but I know in our generation, there's so much more movement and viewpoints that we're collecting, some of which we're aware of and others not. But these can be, really fruitful when you're both briefing and when you're writing, as you can anticipate how it might be perceived in other countries and among other nationalities. So then just my final slide, second final slide is, how then do you want to define your role if you're in the policy sphere? So, and none of these, by the way, are mutually exclusive. Some of them are very complementary. If you're solely based on informative sort of a role, and you want to then ensure that you're timely in your delivery, that it's valuable, that you're referring to very solid sources. And then maybe you're representative as well, or separately. And then how do you use that to enrich discussions? So that might particularly be the case with the Black Lives Matter at the moment, and that you have a particular viewpoint that wasn't represented previously. Then disruptive, what's your focus? And then how are you going to sustain attention? Greta's certainly been good in that, and that she's been extremely disruptive. She didn't come from a policy perspective technically, but she put herself in a very visible position in Stockholm to gather attention, and has gone to all the platforms to try and interact with people, and is doing more webinars. So she's thought about, and her team has thought about how they're sustaining that attention because they've gained huge momentum. Reliable, can you develop credibility and weight? And then provocative, are you the devil's advocate for the sake of it, or are you doing it constructively, and which can be of great use if you're on a panel. And then just a final slide, it was mentioned earlier that by Isabel, COVID-19 has really, really shifted the landscape. So now is a good time to think about how you can add value when there's huge uncertainty and disruption and noise. So many people have opinions on health and what should be done in politics, but where think tanks can distinguish themselves is that they can take a kind of more scientific approach from the political science point of view. Maybe it's forecasting, analysis, scenario building, and there they can demonstrate their experience and knowledge. And then, can you assess the short and long-term repercussions? Who are the stakeholders? What needs to shift from the status quo? What are the underlying structural issues that surfaced, such as inequalities, for instance? And the third is really interesting, that I've personally seen as well, is how can you build a resilient think tank model? So how could you engage with policy digitally, if that's by webinars or by more publications? We use LinkedIn and Twitter quite a lot. It seems to really gain momentum. And just think about how you might also catch the attention of an audience that's working from home at present. So that's really it. Hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview of think tank perspective and how you might integrate.
Thank you so much, Clodagh.